Okay, I'm back. Here we go. Let's talk about some famous EQs. There's two basic kinds of EQs: passive EQs and active EQs. Passive are the old school ones, and there's no active. Remember, when you say somebody says something about active, they mean there's an amplifier built into there, right? And so uh, an active EQ. This is like the more most of the modern ones are active. When you grab the gain, the boost or cut knob, and you turn it up, what you're doing is actually amplifying the signal with an amplifier, with some kind of a FET or a tube. Could be a vacuum tube, or it could be some kind of transistor, even an IC chip. So it's an actual amplifier, right? You turn it up, you want to cut a frequency, you turn it down. Same thing, amplifier turns it down. The old school ones are passive. There was no amplifier built in. The way it worked was with an inductor, a capacitor, uh, things like that, right? And so basically, believe it or not, magnetism, right? And so uh, I want to show you some of the EQs that are famous that you're going to end up seeing, hopefully, more than likely. And there's a lot of plugins that sort of mimic these guys, right? So the first one I'm going to show you is a Pultic EQ. This is probably from I'm not sure, maybe the late 40s, 1950s, somewhere there, right? Pardon me, there's a screen here that I'm going to look at, right? So if you take a look at my mouse, here it is, right? This the way this works, kind of interesting. Um, you choose the frequency you want to affect down here, where it says CP. Notice it says CPS. It doesn't say hertz or kilohertz. It stands for cycles per second. Hertz was something that came along a little bit later on. They wanted to honor this guy by the name of Hertz, who did a lot of really cool stuff in the late 1800s. But anyway, cycles per second. And so right now it's pointed at 60, and you can choose to either boost 60 hertz or cut, attenuate. That's what that stands for. Attenuate 60 hertz. Oh, there's a cat. Or you can do both. Notice here it's turned up. Both of them are turned up to 5. Actually, so we're actually boosting 60 hertz by 5, whatever 5 is. All right, and we're also attenuating or cutting 60 hertz by 5. As it turns out, it's not the exact same frequency on both of those. It's very, very close. And the boost is a shelf, right? The boost is a shelf. There's a cat. The boost is a shelf. The attenuate is actually a peak dip, right? And so it's kind of an interesting thing when you use both of them together like that, and you turn it up by 5. You're actually boosting. Let's say for you guys. So I'm boosting here. Let's say you're boosting 60 hertz. Everything above 60 hertz in this particular situation is getting boosted by 5, right? And then it's also attenuating by 5. And so then it's actually pulling it down. So you get this really bizarre curve, right? It's kind of an interesting thing. This is something that people do a lot of, right? On an EQ. There's plugin versions of this. Waves has one. Universal Audios has one, right? And so you'll see these, and you'll get the opportunity to use it. If not the real one, then certainly a plug-in one, right? Here's the bandwidth, right? Again, that's either a narrow, right? In this case, narrow or wide, right? This bandwidth knob. And then if you'll notice, there's the same thing over here, right? There's a boost and a cut for, I guess in this particular situation, it's 8 kilohertz or 8,000 cycles per second, right? It's pretty cool, right? Interesting, right? So anyway, it's old school EQ. It's very interesting. Some people find them confusing to use, but once you understand what's really going on there, um, it's not so confusing. Right? Let me show you another one here. This is a Manly. This is a Yvonne Manly's massive passive. This is actually a modern EQ, but it's a passive EQ, and it's designed very much like the Pultec, right? Uh, the difference being, of course, if you look at it right there, it has 4 bands instead of just like the 2, right? By the way, that Pultec is only 2 bands. There's no mid, if you notice. If you back in those days, if you wanted to EQ the mid range, you had to actually buy a mid range EQ, right? But here she's got this one here, where if you'll notice, right, here's my frequency selector down here, right, and here's my uh, um, bandwidth selector, right, and here's my boost and cut, the loudness, right? Pretty cool, right? And what's interesting is each one of these bands, if you notice, can be a shelf or a bell or a peak dip, if you will, right? Kind of an interesting design here, right? So you can boost it or cut it. You flip this guy right here. Right? So right now I can't tell. I guess it's at 10, whatever 10 is, right? And it's boosting by 10. If I flip this down to cut, then it's cutting by 10. And it's kind of unique here is that all the bands are either shelf or bell. You get some pretty interesting things going on with there. You don't see these EQs used that much in recording studios, but you definitely see them in mastering studios, right? And of course, you've got a low pass and a high pass filter, right? Now, why are there 2 sides of this? Well, it's stereo, right? It doesn't mean you need to use it as stereo. You can use the left side for kick drum and the right side for bass or something like that. I don't know, right? But it's kind of designed for stereo, right? Fantastic. People love this thing. Fantastic. Here is a Neve 1073, right? This is, again, an old school design. It's probably from 1972 or something like that. Now I should say this is old Neve. This is not new Neve. The Neve mixing console that we have at ACC is a Rupert Neve Designs Neve. This is a Rupert Neve design Neve, but from 1970. That company and this EQ was bought by a company called AMS, and they manufacture this now. And that's what this is. This is an AMS Neve, old school, right? And if you look here, there's actually an EQ and a preamp and EQ both, right? If you come up here, you'll notice that we have a boost cut knob. Here's my loudness knob, right? And it's for the highs, right? And that's it. It's a 3-band EQ, highs, mids, and lows, right? And so this is the highs. I don't remember. This is not a selectable frequency. This is just, the frequency is for this high is fixed. I don't know what it is. I forgot. But I think it's probably like 8K or something like that. You don't get a choice. You just turn it up or turn it down, right? This mid, if you'll notice, the mid one, right? It's what they call a dual concentric knob. There's this outside ring here, and the outside ring is choosing the frequency. If you can see that line right there, it's pointed at 4.8 kilohertz, right? And this gray knob here is kind of stacked on top of it, and that's the volume knob, right? So it looks like it's turning it, right at this particular point, it's turning it down by maybe 2 dB at 4.8K. Then down here, this low frequency is the same kind of deal, right? I'm not sure. You're turning it down by a little bit, and I'm not sure what frequency that is, but somewhere down below. Right? And of course, there's your high-pass filter, right? The international sign for high-pass filter. There it is. Right? That's a very, very super famous EQ. The vintage ones go for, no joke, just 1 will go for like $5,000, right? AMS Neve will sell you that one for like $3,500 or so, somewhere in there, right? Here's an AMS Neve, again, old school, not new school, old, right? It's also a preamping EQ. By the way, that 1073 and this 1081 came out of a mixing console, one old 1970s mixing console. And if you look here, right, here we got our high frequency, right? This is a 4-band EQ, right? High frequency. And notice that the high frequency here can be switched from shelving, if you guys can see my mouse, from shelving to peak dip or bell, right? And again, dual concentric knobs. The outside ring, the silver one, is choosing the frequency, and the dark gray is actually choosing how loud, or whether you're cutting or boosting, right? Looks like it's at 3.3 kilohertz, and it's kind of like in the middle. Right? I guess not boosting or cutting. This is before a fully parametric EQ, and so high Q, right? If you push that button in, it narrowed the Q quite a bit, right? So generally, these Neve EQs are pretty wide and pretty easy to use. But if you made it a high Q, the number is high, which means the Q is going to be, the bandwidth is going to be narrow, right? So that allows you to focus in on a very specific frequency, right? Same thing here down with the low mids, and then of course the lows, and then of course another high pass and low pass. Notice high pass and low pass filters built into this guy here. Pretty cool. These are very, very good EQs. These are EQs that people absolutely love. People's favorite. With that Pultec, that massive passive, these two Neve products, right? This is an API 550A. This is probably came around like in the late 1960s, early 70s, right? This is a passive EQ. Those two Neves are active. This is a passive EQ. And if you'll notice here, we've got the silver or the white thing, knob, I guess is a knob. Determines the volume, how loud a specific frequency is, and the blue knob is the frequency selector. Right now it's pointed at 20 kilohertz. There's a cat. Here's Bailey. Say hi, Bailey. Get him. Sick him. Go get him. Yeah. There's a bird. Go get a bird. A squirrel. Go get that squirrel. All right. She's staring at me like, there's no birds, there's no squirrels. All right. Another EQ that people absolutely love. They love them, right? Very popular. By the way, this 550A, you can buy these brand new, and they're reasonably priced, and they'll fit in a 500 series rack, just like the one we have at ACC, right? Maybe we'll get some before I head to Highland. But there it is. Highs, mids, lows, right? This engages a filter, and it's a high pass filter. I don't remember what frequency it is, but I bet you anything that's around 80 hertz or somewhere in there, right? These two, again, you have to sort of interpret. When I see these things here, they're buttons that engage something that looks like this. That looks to be a shelving thing, right? And so these EQs here, the highs and all three of them actually are peak dip, right, or bell. If I click this LF, it turns the low frequency into a shelving EQ. And same thing with this HF, right? And like most professional EQs, there's a button that you can turn them on or turn them off, right? Because if you don't need it, you don't want your signal running through it. Right? Another super famous EQ, the API 560, still made today. Again, fits in a 500 series rack, very reasonably priced. You can buy one if you save your money. This is, of course, a graphic EQ, right? So uh, instead of having a knob and then a frequency selector and maybe a Q or a bandwidth selector, this is just a graphic EQ, right? And so what you do is you turn the way this one works is it's super easy. You think, oh, it needs more of something. I'm not sure what it is. So you just go to the first slider, turn it up. If that doesn't do it, put it back. Go to the next one. Try it. If that doesn't do it for you, turn it back. Right? Super easy to use. These are fantastic. Amazing, amazing, amazing EQs. Really good on drums. A lot of I've had a lot of experience on old APIs. Most people, when they set up an old API, they'll put these 560s on all the drum channels, right? Because just like the 500 series rack, the API mixing consoles are just like a 500 series. Everything fits, uses the 500 series format, right? You take all your 560 EQs and you line them up on all your what would normally be your drum channels, right? Fantastic, amazing sounding. The tiniest little thing, like move the slider every just the tiniest little bit, makes a huge difference. You can get yourself into trouble because it sounds so good. It sounds so awesome. Hey, baby, get him. Go get him. All right. I may have mentioned it. George Massenburg is the inventor of the fully parametric EQ when he was 17 years old. And this is the GML 8200, another very, very popular, very well-known EQ, right? This is a stereo unit, doesn't have to be used in stereo. If you take a look here, right? 5 bands, right? This is your boost cut, right? And then down here is a dual concentric knob. The one on the outside, the little ring, determines the frequency, and then the knob on the top, the little non-ring one, determines the bandwidth. This is GML. He still makes them. People still love them. Again, it's probably from the early 70s. Take a look at this guy. Oh. Oh. Down you go. This guy, this is over the top. George Massenburg makes a mastering EQ. So does Yvonne Manly. There's a couple other companies, but this guy here, this is a company called SPL. This is a mastering EQ. These guys, each one of these can be peak dip, right? And they can be peak dip, and they can also be what's called constant Q or variable Q, right? Some of these guys, the bandwidth, like for example, the API that I showed you, that 550, the Q is not determined by a knob. The Q is determined by how much you turn up the volume, right? So if I boost it only a little bit, the Q is really wide. If I boost it a lot, the Q gets kind of narrow, right? So this EQ can function like an API, or it can function like a Massenburg, right? Not only that, but this guy will remember your settings. This is kind of important for mastering, where you have a number of settings. You EQ a song, and you think it sounds great, and sure enough, it sounds great. The customer listens to it. They go, well, I like it, but can you add more of this or that? And you can actually, just like software, you can actually, this is a hardware unit, very expensive hardware unit. And just like software, you can recall it. It'll actually remember the setting that it was on. These knobs actually are, there's a little motor, believe it or not, under each one of these knobs. And when you recall it, the knobs will actually move themselves to the appropriate spot. Pretty crazy, right? So there you go. There's a few selected EQs, right? This one you probably won't see, but I guarantee you'll see a lot of 1073s, Pultecs, and the two APIs, the 560 and the 550. If not in hardware, more than likely you will. But if not in hardware, certainly in the software version, plugin version. All right? On to the next video.